The approaching enemy formation had spread out into a classic combat spread, with two MiG-29s taking the lead positions and two older MiG-21s following approximately 2 miles behind. This formation gave them overlapping fields of fire while reducing the chance that a single defensive maneuver could defeat multiple simultaneous attacks. It was exactly the kind of coordinated tactics that made modern air combat so deadly. Thompson was frantically working his backup sensors, trying to extract every bit of useful targeting information from systems that were never designed to be the primary means of air-to-air combat. Lead MiG-29 is approximately 6 miles out, bearing 090 relative. I'm getting intermittent radar returns from our backup system, but nothing solid enough for a long-range missile shot. Martinez was calculating intercept geometry in her head, using techniques that had been standard practice in the 1960s, but were rarely needed in the age of computerized fire control systems. The enemy fighters were approaching from the east, flying directly into the afternoon sun, which would make visual acquisition more difficult, but also interfere with their own targeting systems. "We're going to use the sun angle to our advantage," Martinez announced. "Turn to heading 270 and climb to 35,000 feet. We'll force them to look directly into the sun for their targeting solutions." This was classic air combat maneuvering, using environmental factors to gain tactical advantage over technologically superior opponents. The principle was simple. If the enemy couldn't see you clearly, they couldn't target you effectively. As they climbed toward the sun, Thompson kept monitoring the approaching formation through his infrared sensor. Enemy formation is adjusting course to compensate for our maneuver. They're climbing to match our altitude, but they're having to work harder because of the sun angle. Martinez waited until they reached 35,000 feet, then rolled into a steep diving turn that pointed them directly at the enemy formation. This was another classic maneuver called a high side attack, using altitude advantage to gain energy for the engagement while making it difficult for the enemy to predict their exact flight path. "Range is approximately 4 miles, and closing fast," Thompson reported. "I'm switching to AM-120 since we need the extra range for this engagement." The AM-120 AMRAAM was their longest-range air-to-air missile, capable of engaging targets at distances up to 50 miles under ideal conditions. However, without radar guidance, its effectiveness was significantly reduced. Thompson would have to use the missile's backup infrared seeker mode, which limited its range to approximately 10 miles. "I have a weak infrared lock on the lead MiG-29, Thompson announced. "Range approximately 3 miles. Target is maneuvering defensively, but I think we can get a shot." "Fox 3, Martinez called out, announcing the launch of their first AMRAAM missile. The weapon separated from its pylon and immediately accelerated toward the enemy formation, its rocket motor creating a brilliant white trail against the desert sky. The enemy pilots immediately recognized the incoming threat and began defensive maneuvering. The lead MiG-29 turned hard to the right while deploying countermeasures, but his wingman continued straight ahead, apparently trying to maintain an attack position on Martinez's aircraft. Thompson watched their missile track toward the turning enemy fighter while simultaneously trying to acquire the second MiG-29 with his infrared sensor. "First missile appears to be tracking well. Second target is approximately 2 miles and closing. I need a few more seconds to get a lock." The tactical situation was becoming extremely complex, with multiple aircraft maneuvering at high speed in a relatively small area of airspace. Without radar to provide precise position and velocity information for all the participants, it was becoming difficult to keep track of who was where and what threats were developing. "First missile hit," Thompson suddenly called out. Their AMRAAM had successfully intercepted the lead MiG-29, which exploded in a brilliant fireball that was visible even against the bright afternoon sun. Pieces of debris scattered across several miles of sky as the destroyed aircraft fell toward the desert below. However, the remaining 3 enemy aircraft were still closing rapidly, and the geometry of the engagement was becoming less favorable by the second. The surviving MiG-29 was now approximately 1 mile away and turning to bring his weapons to bear, while the 2 trailing MiG-21s were accelerating to join the engagement. Martinez immediately rolled into another defensive maneuver, using the Super Hornet's superior agility to avoid giving the enemy pilot an easy shot. The MiG-29 was an extremely capable aircraft, but the Super Hornet had certain advantages in close-range maneuvering combat. Second MiG-29 is trying to get on our 6, Thompson warned. Range approximately 800 yards and closing. I'm having trouble maintaining infrared lock because of his maneuvering. Martinez pulled the aircraft through a series of high G turns that pushed both pilots against their seats with tremendous force. The G-suit squeezed their legs and abdomen to prevent blood from pooling in their lower bodies. But the physical stress of sustained maneuvering was beginning to take its toll. The enemy pilot was also maneuvering aggressively, trying to get into a position where he could use either his missiles or his cannon. The two aircraft were now engaged in a classic turning fight, each pilot trying to gain a positional advantage that would allow him to take a killing shot. I've got a brief infrared lock, Thompson announced. Range 600 yards, but the angle is too steep for a good missile shot. We need to extend and try again. Martinez immediately pushed the nose down and accelerated away from the enemy fighter, using the Super Hornet's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain separation. The MiG-29 pilot followed, but his aircraft couldn't quite match their acceleration at this altitude and power setting. He's falling behind, Thompson observed. Range is opening to approximately 1,000 yards. If we can maintain this separation for another few seconds, I might be able to get a better targeting solution. However, the two trailing MiG-21s were now entering the engagement area, approaching from a different angle that threatened to bracket Martinez's aircraft between multiple opponents. Fighting 3 aircraft simultaneously was extremely dangerous, even with superior equipment and training. Thompson suddenly detected a new threat on his infrared sensor. SAM launched from the ground. Bearing 180, range approximately 5 miles. Large missile, probably an SA-6 system. The SA-6 was a medium-range surface-to-air missile system that was extremely lethal to aircraft operating at medium altitudes. Martinez immediately began defensive maneuvering while deploying chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missile's guidance system. "This is getting ridiculous," Martinez muttered as she pulled the aircraft through another series of violent evasive maneuvers. They were now simultaneously engaged with 3 enemy fighters and defending against surface-to-air missiles, all while operating with severely degraded sensor systems. Thompson was trying to track multiple threats with his limited infrared capability while manually calculating engagement priorities. The SAM is the most immediate threat. It'll be here in approximately 30 seconds. The MiG-21s are closing from the north, range about 2 miles. The remaining MiG-29 is still behind us, but gaining slowly. Martinez made a split-second decision to turn directly toward the approaching MiG-21s, using them as involuntary cover against the incoming surface-to-air missile. If she could get close enough to the enemy fighters, the SAM's guidance system might lose lock to avoid hitting its own aircraft. "Bold move," Thompson commented as he watched the tactical display. "The MiG-21s don't know about the SAM behind us. If this works, we might be able to use it to our advantage." The lead MiG-21 pilot apparently thought that Martinez was making a desperate head-on attack and began maneuvering to avoid a collision. This played directly into her plan, as the enemy aircraft's evasive maneuvers brought it directly between her aircraft and the approaching surface-to-air missile. "SAM is confused," Thompson announced with satisfaction. "It's getting multiple heat signatures and can't lock onto any single target. I think it's going to miss everybody." The surface-to-air missile passed harmlessly between the maneuvering aircraft and detonated several miles away, its guidance system having been defeated by the presence of multiple heat sources in close proximity. The tactic had worked perfectly, but now they were in close combat with 2 MiG-21s at very short range. Martinez immediately engaged the nearest MiG-21 with her remaining AM-9X Sidewinder missile. The range was so short that the enemy pilot had virtually no time to react before the infrared-guided weapon struck his aircraft's engine compartment. "Splash 2," Thompson called out as the MiG-21 exploded in a shower of debris. However, the second MiG-21 was now in an ideal position to attack them, approaching from their left side at a range of less than half a mile. Martinez could see tracer rounds from the enemy aircraft's cannon streaking past their cockpit as the MiG-21 pilot opened fire. The enemy's aim was slightly off, but at this range, even a small error could be corrected quickly. "He's got us in his sights," Thompson warned. "Brake left. Brake left." Martinez threw the aircraft into the most violent evasive maneuver she could manage, pulling nearly 9 gs as she turned away from the enemy's line of fire. The MiG-21 pilot tried to follow, but the Super Hornet's superior agility allowed them to outturn the older Soviet fighter. Thompson was now preparing their cannon for action, since they had used all their missiles except for one remaining AIM-120. "Switching to guns," he announced. "I'll need you to get us into a firing position." The cannon engagement would require even more precise maneuvering than missile combat, since the effective range was much shorter and the target had to be held in the gun sight for several seconds to ensure hits. This was the most basic form of air combat, dating back to World War I. Martinez began a climbing turn that would bring them around behind the MiG-21, using superior engine power to gain an altitude advantage. The enemy pilot recognized the threat and attempted his own defensive maneuvers, but his older aircraft simply couldn't match the Super Hornet's performance envelope. "Range approximately 400 yards, Thompson announced as they closed on the enemy fighter. "Target is in a slight left turn, airspeed estimated at 400 knots. You'll need to lead him by about 2 aircraft lengths for the deflection shot." Martinez aligned the gun sight with a point ahead of the enemy aircraft, compensating for his movement and the time it would take for their cannon rounds to reach the target. This was pure pilot skill, the kind of marksmanship that couldn't be taught in simulators or learned from textbooks. "Guns, guns, guns," Martinez called out as she squeezed the trigger. The M61 Vulcan cannon fired at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute, sending a stream of 20mm projectiles toward the maneuvering MiG-21. The first burst missed slightly behind the target as the enemy pilot pulled harder than Martinez had anticipated. She immediately adjusted her aim point and fired again, walking the tracers across the MiG-21's fuselage from tail to nose. Multiple hits sparkled along the enemy aircraft's wing root and engine compartment. Black smoke began pouring from the MiG-21's tailpipe as its engine lost power, and the aircraft entered a gentle descending turn toward the desert below. "Target is hit and losing altitude," Thompson confirmed. "Engine appears to be damaged, but the aircraft is still under control. The pilot might try to make it back to his base." Martinez was about to pursue for another gun attack when Thompson suddenly called out another warning. "The MiG-29 is back. He's been climbing while we were engaged with the MiG-21s, and now he's above us at about 2 miles. Martinez looked up through the canopy and could see the distinctive silhouette of the enemy fighter against the sky. The MiG-29 pilot had used their distraction with the other aircraft to gain a tactical advantage, and now he was in position to attack them from above. "He's starting an attack run," Thompson warned. "Range approximately 1 mile, and closing fast. This guy knows what he's doing." Martinez realized that they were down to their last missile, and their cannon ammunition was running low. If they couldn't defeat this final opponent quickly, they would be effectively defenseless in hostile airspace. The storm clouds that had been building throughout the engagement were now directly overhead, creating an ominous backdrop for what would likely be the final air-to-air engagement of the mission. Lightning flickered within the dark clouds, and Martinez could see curtains of rain beginning to fall in the distance. "We've got one AIM-120 left," Thompson announced. "But without radar lock, we'll have to get much closer than optimal range. And if we miss this shot, we'll be down to guns only against a very experienced pilot." Martinez made a decision that would have seemed insane under normal circumstances. Instead of running from the attacking MiG-29, she turned directly toward it, planning to engage head-on with their last long-range missile. "Head-on attack with a manual infrared lock," she announced. "It's risky, but it gives us the best chance of a hit before he can maneuver defensively." Thompson was already working to acquire the approaching fighter with his infrared sensor. The head-on geometry actually helped with targeting, since the enemy aircraft's engines were pointing directly away from them, creating a strong heat signature that was easy to track. "I have a solid infrared lock," Thompson announced. Range approximately 2 miles, and closing fast. Recommend immediate launch. Fox 3. Martinez called out as she fired their final AMRAAM missile. The weapon accelerated toward the approaching MiG-29 at tremendous speed, covering the distance between the two aircraft in just seconds. The enemy pilot immediately recognized the incoming missile and began defensive maneuvering, but the short range and favorable geometry left him with very limited options. The missile's infrared seeker head tracked his aircraft's heat signature perfectly, ignoring his countermeasures and evasive maneuvers. Direct hit, Thompson shouted as their missile struck the MiG-29 just behind the cockpit. The enemy aircraft disintegrated in a massive explosion, sending debris tumbling toward the desert in a shower of burning metal. Martinez felt a surge of relief as the last enemy fighter was destroyed, but she knew their mission wasn't over yet. They still had to navigate out of hostile airspace and return to their carrier, all while operating with severely degraded sensors and in deteriorating weather conditions. Strike 1. This is Overwatch, came a voice over the radio. We show multiple splashes in your area. What's your status? Overwatch, Strike 1, Martinez replied. We've engaged and destroyed 4 enemy aircraft using manual targeting techniques after radar failure. Primary mission was successful, but we used most of our ammunition in the air-to-air engagements. Outstanding work, Strike 1, came the response. Vector to Rally Point Alpha for aerial refueling and escort back to the ship. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, so time is critical. Thompson was already programming their navigation system with the coordinates for the rally point where they would meet their tanker aircraft. Course is 295 degrees, range approximately 40 miles. We should be there in about 8 minutes if we maintain current speed. As they flew toward the rally point, Martinez reflected on the engagement they had just survived. The radar failure had forced them to fight using techniques and skills that most modern pilots rarely practiced, relying on visual contact and manual calculations instead of computer-assisted targeting systems. The mission had been successful despite the equipment failures and enemy resistance. The terrorist compound had been destroyed, eliminating a high-value target that had evaded capture for 3 years. More importantly, they had proven that traditional piloting skills remained relevant even in an age of advanced technology. Thompson was monitoring their fuel state while keeping watch for any additional threats. Fuel looks good for the transit back to the ship, he reported. And I'm not seeing any more enemy activity in the area. I think we're clear. The storm clouds were now directly above them, creating turbulence that rocked their aircraft as they flew through the unstable air mass. Lightning flashed continuously within the clouds, creating a spectacular but dangerous light show that threatened to interfere with their already degraded navigation systems. Visual contact with the tanker, Martinez announced as she spotted the distinctive silhouette of the KC-135 Stratotanker ahead of them. The large aircraft was orbiting at a safe altitude, waiting to provide fuel for any surviving members of the strike package. Strike 1, this is Texaco, came the voice of the tanker crew. We have fuel available and are ready for immediate service. What's your fuel state? Thompson checked their gauges and calculated how much fuel they would need for the return flight to the carrier. We're showing about 40% remaining, which should be adequate, but we'll take a top off for safety margins. The aerial refueling process was routine but required precise flying, especially in the turbulent conditions created by the approaching storm system. Martinez maneuvered their aircraft into position behind the tanker while Thompson coordinated with the boom operator. Contact, the boom operator announced as the refueling probe connected with their aircraft's receptacle. Fuel began flowing immediately, restoring their reserves for the flight back to the USS Ronald Reagan. As they took on fuel, Martinez had time to process everything that had happened during the mission. The radar failure had been a serious equipment malfunction that could have resulted in mission failure or loss of aircraft and crew. However, their training in manual targeting techniques had allowed them to adapt and overcome the technical problems. Disconnect complete, the boom operator announced after several minutes. You're topped off and ready to go. Safe flight home. Martinez moved away from the tanker and turned toward the coordinates where their carrier was operating. The storm system was moving rapidly across their flight path, creating weather conditions that would make carrier landing operations extremely challenging. Strike 1. This is Reagan Base. Came a transmission from their ship. Be advised that weather conditions are marginal for recovery operations. We're experiencing heavy rain and gusty winds. Approach with caution. Thompson was already reviewing the emergency procedures for carrier landings in bad weather. Without their primary radar system, they would have to rely on the ship's approach control radar and their backup navigation systems to guide them safely back to the flight deck. Weather radar shows the worst of the storm system should pass through our area in about 20 minutes, Thompson reported. If we can time our approach correctly, we might be able to land during a brief break in the weather. Martinez adjusted their flight path to intercept the carrier's course while staying clear of the most severe weather. The mission that had begun as a routine precision strike had evolved into one of the most challenging combat experiences of her career. As they approached the carrier for landing, both pilots knew that their successful use of manual targeting techniques had not only saved their own lives, but had also demonstrated the continuing importance of fundamental flying and fighting skills in modern aerial warfare. The radar had failed them when they needed it most, but their training, experience, and determination had seen them through. The mission was complete, and they were coming home. Thompson's eyes were glued to the small infrared display, one of the few sensors still providing useful information about their tactical situation. The heat signature he had spotted was definitely an enemy fighter aircraft, and it was climbing rapidly toward their altitude. Without radar range and bearing information, determining the exact threat level required old-school estimation techniques that most modern pilots rarely practiced. Contact is definitely hostile, Thompson reported, his voice steady despite the stress. Based on visual signature and flight profile, I'm calling it a MiG-29 Fulcrum. Estimated range for miles and closing. Martinez immediately began defensive maneuvering, using the aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain altitude while maintaining visual contact with the approaching threat. The Super Hornet's twin engines responded instantly to her commands, pulling them up and away from the desert floor at a rate that would make any enemy pilot work hard to maintain and intercept course. Strike 2, Strike 3, what's your status? Martinez called to her wingman. Strike 2 engaged with multiple contacts to the north, came the tense reply. Strike 3 is defending against SAM launches from the target area. We're all pretty busy down here. Martinez realized that their formation was being systematically separated and engaged by a coordinated enemy response. This wasn't just a few patrol aircraft stumbling across their strike package. This was a well-planned defensive operation designed to trap them in hostile airspace and destroy them piecemeal. Thompson continued tracking the approaching MiG-29 through his infrared sensor while manually calculating intercept solutions. Target is approximately 3 miles now, bearing 020 relative, climbing to match our altitude. We need to make a decision soon, or he's going to get a shot. Without radar lock-on capability, their options for beyond visual range combat were severely limited. The AM-120 AMRAAM missiles carried by their aircraft required radar guidance for long-range shots, and the backup infrared guidance mode had limited range and effectiveness. They would likely have to close to visual range and engage with their shorter-range AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles. Martinez made a split-second tactical decision. We're going to turn into him. If we can get close enough for a Sidewinder shot, we can take him down before he gets organized. She rolled the aircraft into a steep left turn, pointing directly at where she estimated the enemy fighter would be in 30 seconds. This was a classic example of manual intercept geometry, the kind of calculation that fighter pilots had been making since the dawn of aerial combat. Thompson kept his eyes on the infrared display while reaching for the weapons control panel. Switching to AIM-9X, he announced. Seeker head is warming up, but I won't have lock-on tone until we get much closer. The Sidewinder missile was an infrared-guided weapon that homed in on the heat signature of enemy aircraft engines. Unlike radar-guided missiles, it didn't require the launching aircraft to maintain target illumination throughout the flight. However, it also had a much shorter range and required the launching aircraft to get dangerously close to its target. Visual contact, Martinez suddenly called out. Through the aircraft canopy, She could see a small speck against the brown desert background, growing larger as the two aircraft closed on each other at a combined speed of over 1,000 miles per hour. MiG-29 confirmed, approximately 2 miles, and closing fast. The enemy aircraft was also maneuvering aggressively, apparently trying to gain a positional advantage for its own missile shot. Martinez could see the distinctive twin-engine configuration and angular wings that identified the aircraft as one of the Soviet Union's most capable air-to-air fighters. Thompson was working frantically with his backup targeting systems, trying to get enough sensor information to support a missile shot. I'm getting intermittent infrared lock-ons, but the signal keeps breaking up. We're going to have to get closer. Martinez pushed the aircraft into an even steeper dive, using gravity to increase their closure rate, while making it harder for the enemy pilot to predict their flight path. The ground rushed up toward them at an alarming rate. But she knew that altitude was less important than position in this engagement. 1 mile and closing, Thompson announced. I have a weak infrared lock. Recommend we take the shot now before he gets inside our turn radius. Fox 2, Martinez called out, announcing the launch of their first Sidewinder missile. The weapon separated from its pylon with a sharp jolt, its rocket motor immediately igniting to push it toward the enemy aircraft at over twice the speed of sound. Both pilots watched as the missile's white smoke trail arced across the sky toward the approaching MiG-29. The enemy pilot immediately began defensive maneuvers, deploying flares and chaff, while turning hard to try to break the missile's lock-on. Missile tracking, Thompson reported. Target is deploying countermeasures, but the seeker head appears to be maintaining lock. For 10 seconds that felt like hours, they watched their missile close the distance to the enemy fighter. The MiG-29 was pulling desperate evasive maneuvers, its pilot clearly aware that his life depended on breaking the incoming weapons guidance system. Miss, Thompson suddenly called out in disappointment. The enemy aircraft's countermeasures and evasive maneuvering had successfully defeated their missile, which detonated harmlessly several hundred feet away from its intended target. Martinez immediately began positioning for another shot, but the geometry of the engagement had changed dramatically. The two aircraft were now much closer together, flying almost parallel courses at the same altitude. This was exactly the kind of close-range, maneuvering combat that modern air forces tried to avoid. He's turning into us, Thompson warned. Range approximately half a mile, closing fast. I think he's trying for a gun solution. The MiG-29 was indeed turning toward them, its pilot apparently deciding to engage with his aircraft's built-in cannon rather than attempting a missile shot. This was both good news and bad news for Martinez and Thompson. The good news was that cannon fire was much less lethal than guided missiles. The bad news was that it meant they were about to enter a close-range dogfight with an experienced enemy pilot. Martinez immediately pulled the aircraft into a vertical climb, using the Super Hornet's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain an altitude advantage. The enemy pilot followed, but his aircraft's performance envelope was slightly different, giving Martinez an opportunity to dictate the terms of the engagement. He's trying to match our climb, Thompson observed. But I think we're pulling away slowly. His aircraft isn't quite as powerful as ours at this altitude. Martinez reached the top of her climb at nearly 40,000 feet, then rolled inverted and pulled through into a steep dive back toward the desert floor. This was a classic boom and zoom tactic, using superior performance to gain energy advantage over an opponent. The MiG-29 pilot attempted to follow their maneuver, but his aircraft was less efficient at high altitude and couldn't maintain the same rate of climb. As Martinez dove back toward the lower altitudes where both aircraft performed better, she had gained several seconds of separation that could be crucial for lining up another missile shot. I'm getting another infrared lock, Thompson announced as they descended through 25,000 feet. Target is approximately 1 mile behind us, trying to follow our dive. Martinez waited until they reached 15,000 feet, then pulled out of the dive and immediately turned back toward the enemy aircraft. This reversal caught the MiG-29 pilot off guard, as he was still following their previous flight path and, suddenly, found himself flying directly toward their nose. Perfect setup, Thompson called out excitedly. Range 800 yards, closure rate very high. I have a solid infrared lock this time. Fox 2. Martinez announced their second Sidewinder launch. This time, the geometry was much more favorable, with the enemy aircraft flying almost directly toward their missile rather than trying to maneuver away from it. The enemy pilot immediately recognized the threat and began another series of desperate evasive maneuvers, but the range was too short and the angle too favorable for effective countermeasures. The missile covered the distance in just seconds, its infrared seeker head tracking the hot exhaust from the MiG-29's twin engines. Hit! Thompson shouted as their missile detonated directly behind the enemy aircraft. The explosion was clearly visible from their cockpit, and pieces of debris tumbled away from the impact point as the MiG-29's engine suddenly went silent. Martinez watched as the enemy aircraft entered an uncontrolled spin, black smoke pouring from its damaged rear fuselage. The pilot's ejection seat fired just seconds later, and a parachute bloomed in the sky as the pilotless fighter continued its death spiral toward the desert below. Splash 1 MiG-29, Martinez reported over the radio. Enemy pilot has ejected safely. However, there was no time to celebrate their victory. Thompson was already scanning his infrared sensor for additional threats, and what he saw was deeply concerning. Multiple contacts approaching from the east and south, he reported. I count at least 3 more aircraft, possibly 4. Range approximately 10 miles, and closing. Martinez felt her heart sink. They had used 2 of their 4 air-to-air missiles destroying 1 enemy fighter, and now they were facing multiple additional threats with degraded sensors and dwindling ammunition. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Strike 2, Strike 3. What's your status? She called to her wingmen. Strike 2 has splashed 1 bandit, but took damage from a SAM, came the reply. We're leaking fuel and need to return to base immediately. Strike 3 is engaging multiple contacts, came another transmission. We're outnumbered at least 3-1 down here. Martinez realized that their strike package was being systematically destroyed by a coordinated enemy response that had been planned well in advance. Someone had known they were coming, and the enemy had prepared accordingly. Thompson was tracking the approaching enemy aircraft through his limited infrared sensor while manually calculating intercept solutions. Lead element appears to be 2 more MiG-29s, range approximately 8 miles. Following element looks like older aircraft, possibly MiG-21s. The MiG-21 was an older, less capable fighter, but it was still dangerous in the hands of an experienced pilot. More importantly, the enemy was now attacking them with coordinated formations rather than individual aircraft, making the tactical problem much more complex. Martinez made another critical decision. We need to get out of here before they overwhelm us. Set course for the extraction point and maintain defensive formation. She turned the aircraft toward the northwest, heading for the predetermined rally point where they could meet up with their tanker aircraft and any surviving members of the strike package. However, the enemy fighters were closing rapidly, and it was unclear whether they could escape before being engaged again. Thompson continued monitoring their pursuers while working with his backup navigation systems. Enemy formation is closing fast. Lead element will be in missile range in approximately 3 minutes. I don't think we can outrun them. Martinez realized that they would have to fight their way out of hostile airspace using manual targeting techniques that hadn't been the primary mode of air combat since the 1970s. Every missile shot would have to be carefully planned and executed, since they didn't have unlimited ammunition for a prolonged engagement. Overwatch, Strike 1, she transmitted. We're being pursued by multiple enemy aircraft and need immediate support. Can you vector additional assets to our position? Strike 1, Overwatch, came the reply. All available assets are currently engaged. You're on your own for at least 15 minutes. 15 minutes was an eternity in modern air combat. The approaching enemy fighters would be in weapons range long before help could arrive, meaning that Martinez and Thompson would have to survive multiple engagements using only their remaining missiles and the aircraft's internal cannon. Thompson was already preparing for the next engagement, checking their remaining weapons inventory and calculating firing solutions for multiple targets. We have 2 AAM 9X and 2 AAM 120s remaining, plus 500 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition. If we're careful and accurate, we might be able to handle 4 enemy aircraft. Martinez knew that their survival now depended entirely on their ability to manually target and engage multiple threats without the benefit of modern radar systems. Every shot would have to count, and every tactical decision would have to be perfect. The storm clouds that had been building throughout the engagement were now much closer, creating an additional hazard that could either provide concealment or trap them in weather conditions that would make visual targeting impossible. As the enemy formation closed to within missile range, Martinez prepared for the most challenging air combat of her career, knowing that their lives now depended on skills and techniques that predated the computer age of modern warfare. The morning sun barely pierced through the thick clouds over the Mediterranean Sea as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her headset one final time. She sat in the pilot's seat of the F divided by a -18F Super Hornet, her hands steady on the controls despite the gravity of the mission ahead. Behind her, Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson, her weapons systems officer, ran through the final pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. "All systems green, Captain," Thompson reported, his voice crackling through the intercom. "Radar is showing optimal performance. Targeting systems are locked and loaded." Martinez nodded, though Thompson couldn't see her from his position. They had trained for this mission countless times, but today was different. Today was real. Intelligence reports had confirmed that a high-value terrorist target was meeting with arms dealers at a remote compound in the Syrian desert. The window of opportunity was narrow, just 4 hours before the target would disappear back into the underground network that had kept him hidden for 3 years. The USS Ronald Reagan, their carrier home base, cut through the choppy waters below them. From the flight deck, Martinez could see the controlled chaos of a carrier launch operation. Deck crews in colorful jerseys moved with practiced efficiency, preparing aircraft for what could be one of the most critical strikes of the year. "Strike 1. You are cleared for takeoff," came the voice of the air traffic controller. "Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. You'll have approximately 2 hours before the storm front moves in." Martinez pushed the throttle forward, feeling the familiar surge of power as the twin engines roared to life. The catapult system engaged with a violent jerk, launching their 20-ton aircraft from 0 to 150 miles per hour in just 2 seconds. The sensation never got old, even after hundreds of carrier launches. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Thompson began reviewing the mission parameters one more time. Target is located at coordinates 35.7 north, 39.2 east. Compound consists of 3 main buildings, with the primary target expected to be in the central structure. "We have authorization for precision strikes only, minimal collateral damage." The flight to the target area would take 90 minutes, giving them time to review contingency plans and coordinate with other elements of the strike package. 2 more Super Hornets flanked them at a distance, call sign Strike 2 and Strike 3, each carrying similar ordnance loads. Above them, an E-2 Hawkeye provided early warning radar coverage, while a KC-135 tanker aircraft stood by for aerial refueling if needed. Martinez checked her instruments as they settled into formation. The radar display showed clear skies ahead, with no hostile aircraft detected in their flight path. The mission had been planned to avoid known surface-to-air missile sites, following a route that would keep them in international airspace until the final approach to target. "Strike 1. This is Overwatch," came the voice of the mission commander aboard the Hawkeye. "Intelligence update. Target confirmed on site as of 15 minutes ago. Weather window is holding, but barely. You'll need to be in and out fast." Thompson acknowledged the transmission while updating their navigation system with the latest intelligence data. The compound they were approaching had been under surveillance for weeks, with satellite imagery providing detailed layouts of the buildings and defensive positions. What concerned the intelligence analysts was the presence of several large trucks that had arrived just hours before. If those trucks contained surface-to-air missiles, the mission could become significantly more dangerous. As they crossed into Syrian airspace, Martinez felt the familiar tension that came with entering hostile territory. Every radar sweep could potentially detect surface-to-air missiles locking onto their aircraft. Every radio transmission could be intercepted by enemy forces. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage, and they intended to use it fully. Approaching initial point, Thompson announced, Beginning final systems check. He ran through the weapons systems one more time, ensuring that their GPS-guided bombs were properly programmed with target coordinates. Each bomb weighed 500 pounds and was capable of penetrating reinforced concrete before detonating. With 3 bombs on board, they had enough firepower to level the entire compound if necessary. Martinez banked the aircraft slightly to the left, following the planned approach route that would bring them to the target from the southwest. The desert landscape below them was barren and brown, broken only by occasional roads and scattered buildings. In the distance, she could see the dark smudge that marked their destination. "Strike 1, this is Strike 2, came a voice from their wingman. "We're picking up some electronic interference on our radar. Could be countermeasures from the target area." This was not unexpected. Intelligence had suggested that the compound might have basic electronic warfare capabilities, including radar jammers designed to interfere with incoming aircraft. However, their GPS-guided weapons should be immune to such countermeasures, relying on satellite navigation rather than radar for terminal guidance. Thompson was focused on his targeting display, using the aircraft's advanced sensors to begin mapping the target area. "I have visual on the compound," he reported. 3 buildings as expected, multiple vehicles in the courtyard. "I'm seeing heat signatures that suggest the buildings are occupied." Martinez adjusted their altitude to 30,000 feet, high enough to be relatively safe from most surface-to-air weapons, but low enough for accurate bombing. The desert air was clear, providing excellent visibility despite the approaching storm clouds on the horizon. Beginning attack run, Martinez announced. She rolled the aircraft into a gentle dive, lining up on the approach heading that would give Thompson the best targeting solution. The compound grew larger in their view, and she could make out individual buildings and vehicles scattered around the perimeter. Thompson's hands moved quickly over his control panels, designating targets and programming the guidance systems for each bomb. The primary target was the central building, where intelligence suggested the terrorist leader was meeting with arms dealers. Secondary targets were the flanking structures that appeared to house communications equipment and weapons storage. "Targets locked and programmed," Thompson reported. "Ready for weapons release on your command." Martinez checked her instruments one final time. Altitude, 28,000 feet. Airspeed, 450 knots. All systems were functioning perfectly. The radar showed no hostile aircraft in the area, and their electronic countermeasures suite was operating normally. "Strike package, this is Overwatch," came the mission commander's voice. "You are cleared hot." "Repeat, you are cleared hot." "Execute at will." Martinez felt her heart rate increase as she prepared for weapons release. This was the moment they had trained for, the culmination of months of preparation and planning. In just minutes, they would either successfully eliminate a high-value target or face the consequences of mission failure. 5 seconds to release point, Thompson announced, his voice steady despite the tension. 4, 3, 2, 1, bombs away. Martinez felt the aircraft lurch slightly as 3 500-pound bombs separated from their pylons and began their 40,000-foot journey to the target below. Each bomb would take approximately 60 seconds to reach impact, guided by GPS satellites orbiting high above the battlefield. "Bombs in flight," Thompson confirmed. "Tracking nominal. Impact in 55 seconds." Martinez began a climbing turn to the right, following standard procedures to clear the target area before the bombs detonated. Behind them, Strike 2 and Strike 3 were beginning their own attack runs, ready to follow up with additional strikes if needed. "Strike 1, this is Strike 2, came an urgent voice over the radio. "We're showing multiple radar contacts approaching from the east. Possible hostile aircraft inbound." Martinez immediately checked her own radar display, but the screen showed nothing but static. A cold feeling settled in her stomach as she realized what was happening. "Thompson, check the radar system," she ordered. "I'm not seeing anything." Thompson's fingers flew over his control panel, running diagnostic checks on their radar systems. "We've got a problem, Captain. Primary radar is down. Backup radar is showing intermittent contacts only. I think we're flying blind." The timing couldn't have been worse. Their bombs were still in flight toward the target, with 40 seconds remaining until impact. Meanwhile, hostile aircraft were apparently approaching their position, and their primary sensor for detecting and tracking threats was completely dead. Strike package, this is Overwatch, came the mission commander's voice, now urgent and clipped. Be advised, we are tracking 4 hostile aircraft approaching your position from multiple vectors. Recommend immediate defensive maneuvers. Martinez felt adrenaline surge through her system. Without radar, they couldn't see the threats coming. They couldn't lock onto targets with their air-to-air missiles. They were effectively fighting blind in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Thompson, how long until our bombs hit? She asked while banking the aircraft hard to the right, beginning evasive maneuvers. 20 seconds to impact, he replied, his voice tight with concentration. But, Captain, without radar, we won't know if we hit the targets. We'll have to rely on visual confirmation only. Martinez realized the full scope of their problem. Not only were they flying blind in the face of enemy fighters, but they would have no way to assess the effectiveness of their strike. If the bombs missed their targets, they might need to make additional attacks, but without radar guidance, hitting precision targets would be nearly impossible. Overwatch, Strike 1, Martinez transmitted. Primary radar is down. Request immediate support and guidance for defensive measures. Strike 1, Overwatch copies. Strike 2 and Strike 3, close formation on Strike 1 and provide radar coverage. All aircraft prepare for possible air-to-air engagement. Martinez watched as her wingmen moved closer, their aircraft taking positions that would allow their functioning radar systems to provide some coverage for the formation. However, she knew that flying in close formation also made them more vulnerable to enemy missiles and reduced their ability to maneuver defensively. Impact! Thompson suddenly shouted. Below them, 3 massive explosions erupted from the target compound, sending columns of smoke and debris high into the desert air. Even from their altitude, the devastation was clearly visible. Target destroyed, Thompson confirmed, watching the smoke rise from where the buildings had stood moments before. All 3 bombs appear to have hit their designated targets. But there was no time to celebrate. The radar-guided surface-to-air missiles were now launching from positions around the target area, their white trails clearly visible against the brown desert landscape. "Sam's in the air," Martinez called out, pulling the aircraft into a violent climbing turn while deploying chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missiles. Without radar, they had to rely on visual detection and the warnings from their wingmen to avoid the deadly projectiles. "Strike 2 has lock on hostile fighter," came a voice over the radio, requesting permission to engage. "Engage at will," came the immediate response from Overwatch. All aircraft cleared to defend themselves. Martinez watched as one of their wingmen fired an air-to-air missile at a target she couldn't even see on her dead radar display. The situation was rapidly deteriorating into exactly the kind of complex, multi-threat environment that made modern air combat so dangerous. Thompson was frantically working his backup systems, trying to get some kind of sensor information that would help them navigate the threats around them. "I've got partial function on the infrared search and track system," he reported. "It's not much, but I can see heat signatures from the enemy aircraft." Martinez realized that they would have to rely on the most basic form of air combat: visual contact and manual targeting. It was a throwback to an earlier era of aerial warfare, when pilots had to see their targets with their own eyes and estimate range and bearing manually. "All aircraft, this is Strike 1, she transmitted. "We're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way. Visual contact only, manual targeting. Thompson, start calling out contacts as you see them." The storm clouds that had been building on the horizon were now moving rapidly toward their position, threatening to reduce visibility even further. If they became trapped in the weather system while fighting enemy aircraft, the situation would become almost hopeless. Thompson suddenly spotted movement in his peripheral vision. "Contact. 2 o'clock low, approximately 5 miles. Appears to be a MiG-29 climbing toward our position." Martinez immediately turned toward the contact, straining her eyes to acquire the target visually. Without radar ranging information, she would have to estimate the distance and closure rate manually, relying on decades of training and experience to guide her weapons employment decisions. The mission had gone from routine precision strike to desperate survival in a matter of minutes. As they prepared for air-to-air combat with severely degraded sensors, Martinez knew that the next few minutes would test every skill she and Thompson had developed throughout their naval careers. The bombs had hit their targets, but now they had to fight their way out of hostile airspace while flying essentially blind. The manual targeting skills that had once been considered obsolete were suddenly the only thing standing between them and disaster. Below them, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no sanctuary from the enemy fighters that were closing in. Above them, the storm clouds continued to build, threatening to engulf them in a meteorological nightmare that would make their tactical situation even worse. Martinez gripped the controls tighter and began the most challenging combat of her career, knowing that survival would depend on skills and techniques that predated the computer age of modern warfare. The radar had failed them, but their training and determination remained intact. The real battle was just beginning.